So GIS is really powerful. It's a really powerful tool, and it can have wide-ranging implications. Historically speaking, cartography and spatial data have often been used by those with power and money as a tool of oppression and exploitation. However, GIS is a tool that can be used to do a lot of good in the world when it's used in an ethical fashion. So I'm just going to show you a handful of examples through history where mapping has done a lot of harm, and then try and show you a handful of examples where it's been used to do some good. So all these boundaries that we exist within are essentially arbitrary lines on a map. Just draw lines, they have wide-ranging implications. Which side of a border you grow up on can have a very significant impact on your life. So two key examples from history are the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East after World War I and the partitioning of Africa. So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was a diverse, multicultural state that had existed for hundreds of years, was partitioned by predominantly the British, mostly following arbitrary lines that were drawn to maximize their access to resources. So the British wanted oil. They drew these arbitrary lines on a map to basically ensure that they got access to various oil fields. There was little to no regard for the people who lived in these regions, the cultures that resided there, any potential conflicts between groups or anything like that. So while these people had existed fairly harmoniously within the Ottoman Empire, there are some notable examples like the Armenian genocide, but all these different cultures had, for the most part, existed in the Ottoman Empire without serious issue. When the British drew these arbitrary lines on a map, it had wide-ranging implications that led to severe issues down the line that we're still experiencing ramifications of today. The same thing with the partitioning of Africa. Africa is a very diverse continent, many, many cultures, languages, and again, lots of groups that worked together, existed, coexisted side by side. You know, some with more conflict, some with less, but they had their own, boundaries set up. And then the British, the French, and other European powers came in and just sliced it up like a pie, drew arbitrary lines on a map and said, we own this, you own that, with no regard for the pre-existing circumstances on the ground. And again, this has also had wide-ranging implications. You're sometimes forced to people groups that did not get along to coexist in one, nation state that can cause serious issues, or you divide people groups between separate nation states that can also create serious issues. So a lot of thought needs to be put into how we create boundaries, what boundaries mean. When they're just carelessly drawn with disregard for the facts on the ground, you end up with serious issues. More locally, mapping was an essential tool used by the Canadian government to displace First Nations. One key example is the 11 numbered treaties that were signed between 1871 and 1921. These are oral agreements between the government and First Nations that were later written down by the government, often excluding some portions of the agreement that were verbally made, omitting oral promises, and inserting other bits of information that were left out entirely. And generally speaking, the First Nations peoples were coerced or forced into signing these documents, oftentimes forced to do so by the RCMP. And so how this worked is the government, through the Geologic Survey and other mapping organizations, had mapped most of the valuable land. So they knew what they wanted. They knew what lands were most productive. They had a record of, that for very large areas. And they used this information to push First Nations populations onto reserves so that traditional lands that were most valuable could then be settled by colonists. And so the whole aim of this numbered treaties thing was to erase First Nations from the continent and or force their assimilation into white Canadian society. And so again, this is a specific example of how mapping and cartography and geographic information has been used as a tool of oppression to do a lot of harm to Indigenous populations in Canada. Looking at the United States, although this example does apply in Canada as well, it's most notable and most severe in the United States. There's something known as redlining, which is a practice that started in 1936 during the Great Depression. The Home Owners Loan Corporation was created. And this was a process where banks would systemically suppress minority populations by refusing to grant loans and to certain neighborhoods, or increasing prices for minorities looking to buy in white neighborhoods. So I'll talk more in detail about this later on in the course. This is most prominent in the United States, but it also occurred in Canada, although it wasn't formally institutionalized like it was in the US. But mapping can be used for good. It's a really powerful tool to put information out there. So for instance, in the 1980s, a series of studies were conducted, one called The Color of Money, that sort of brought to light this practice of redlining. So even though people knew that neighborhoods were segregated, it was sort of hid from the public that banks were actually doing this. And so they were able to use GIS to specifically map out the segregation of neighborhoods and match that up with these zones that banks had created to essentially prove that this was going on and finally force the government to address the issue and make it illegal for banks to do this. Although the implications of the segregation that was generated by this are still very pervasive today. An example from Canada is the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project. So this was a participatory / counter-mapping project that was aimed at safeguarding Inuit rights to Arctic lands and waters. And so essentially what had happened was the Inuit were becoming increasingly concerned about Canadian expansion into their lands, specifically resource extraction projects that were causing damage to the wildlife and their traditional land. So a project was created, which was actually foundational in the creation of the province of Nunavut, where the Inuit Trapperists Association commissioned a study on the land use and occupancy of Nunavut. And so this work actually made no references to existing work or secondary sources of information, because those were almost always written from the white Southern perspective. Rather, it relied on 100% original data collection from Inuit sources. So trappers and other elders and people within the community were interviewed and collaboratively created maps with the researchers to map out where Inuit resources were located, so their hunting grounds and things like that, and where cultural sites currently are and historically have been located. And so this was instrumental in the establishment of Nunavut, because they created this record to verifiably show, to prove that this land was valuable and important to the Inuit people, and that all of it was being used. And so they used that to leverage for the creation of Nunavut. Some other examples, a little closer to home. It can be used as a great tool for conservation and habitat protection. So for instance, you can map out orca populations and the probability of oil spills or oil presence and see how that influences orca migrations, for instance. You can use it to map out any variety of wildlife populations, so tracking caribou, different populations, different herds, for instance. And then just some other examples, mapping police violence in the United States. Again, the native land example that I showed at the beginning during the land acknowledgement can be used to track COVID cases and information. So It's a really powerful tool. It can be used to do a lot of good in the world, but we do need to be cognizant of how it's been used to cause harm in the past and how it can continue to be used intentionally or unintentionally to, cause harm. So that's it for today's lecture. I hope you're all excited about learning GIS. And on Thursday, I'm going to talk about map projections. How do we take the big ball that is the lumpy rock flying through space that is Earth and display that on a two-dimensional piece of paper or computer screen?